And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to The Money Show. Well, a series of developments that I don't think anyone expected. Very few people would have had the inside track on what was going to happen. The fact that the budget has been postponed to the 12th of March. First time it's happened. I cannot remember it happening in our democratic history. And if it matters, I don't think it happened before that either. As I was sitting in the studio, watching it, listening to it, several things crossed through my mind. The one was, I just can't remember feeling as shocked by a development in South Africa, not because of the importance of it, it is important, of course, but because of the sheer surprise of it. I was reminded, strangely, of a phone call I received from an editor who had told me Nhlanhla Nene had been fired on that day in December 2015, and all that followed. What struck out for me from that was how long it took for us as a nation to restore faith in our finances following that sort of long weekend in December 2015. How many things had to happen? And for years, everything has been based on a sound and predictable budget process. And I can't help but wonder if faith in that has been shattered today in some way. Yes, it will be put back together again. The politicians will work and they will talk and they will posture and they'll shout. And at some point there'll be some agreement, I presume, I hope. But I can't help but just wonder if that faith, which had always been almost sacrosanct, there will be a budget at 2:00 on a Wednesday. We will all know what's going to happen. People used to talk about how it was such a transparent budget process. And in one move, I fear that some of that faith has now been removed. That's what scares me tonight. Lots of reaction, of course. The JSE was down 0.49% on the day just as the announcement was being made, ended down 0.81. The Rand, just as the announcement was made, 18.48 to the dollar, is now at sort of 18.54. All of that suggests that there may be other factors, that the markets may still take some time to react. But of course, the focus tonight on The Money Show, the postponement, the unprecedented postponement in the budget. Your view, please, on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes on 072 702 1702.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
I suppose one of the things that you really worry about is that this is a demonstration of the problems that we may now have in the coalition from government, the coalition government from here on in. The sticking point, why the budget did not come today, is that the DA says it will not support a budget and will not vote in favour of a budget that includes a hike of 2 percentage points in VAT. Well, we start your reaction tonight with Alan Mukoki, the CEO at the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Alan, good evening. We have a coalition party, a government. It's supposed to involve different parties. They've been working together. The formation of the coalition improved business sentiment. Now this has happened. What message does this send to business?
Well, I think that, good evening to you and your listeners, Stephen. I think that as South Africans, we should brace ourselves that we should actually accept some of the pitfalls of pulling together a coalition. It does, of course, damage confidence because quite clearly people have not been able to agree. And yet, at the same time, if the issue is as it is being expressed, obviously we haven't heard officially whether that was the issue, but if the issue is, of course, we as business ourselves would not necessarily support a VAT increase at this particular time. We don't think that that would be a very positive move, given the fact that the economy is not performing, people are not employed. You don't want to be increasing the costs of business at this particular point in time. So that necessarily would not be something that we ourselves would be able to support. But on the issue of whether people can agree or not, South Africans need to be very conscious and aware of what happens in other mature democracies. You would know that in the United States, for instance, both houses, the Congress and the Senate, have struggled for 27 years to actually pass a budget on time. Even last year, you saw what happened with Michael Johnson, the leader of the Senate, as Chuck Schumer, when they were haggling over the government is going to shut down because we're not going to do that. Last year, again, December, Netanyahu was struggling to pass that budget in the Knesset in Israel, and it ended up being passed on a 59-57 vote because it was that tight, and some of the coalition partners wanted to walk away from it. Germany's government fell apart last year in November on the issue of budget in particular, because Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, was accusing his FM Lindner of not relaxing the spending cuts that he was trying to do, and that government actually fell apart completely into the coalition government. So the point I'm really making about that, and you saw the same thing in the UK with Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister and Kwarteng was the Chancellor at the time, when they were trying to iterate a corporate tax cut, which was not going to be funded at 45 billion, and that caused a serious significant problem in the UK markets, and they had to actually reverse it. So these things are normal in democracies that are maturing and matured. South Africa is a very vibrant democracy. It's full of vitality. We should take things in our stride sometimes and not over-panic. The VAT issue, if it is indeed the VAT issue, has got to be rejected from our side. We'll have to fight. Government must find a way of funding that, and we say that cut the fat in the expenditure of government, and let's see what we can do.
Alan Mukoki, thank you, CEO at the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Peter Attard Montalto is Managing Director at Krutham. Peter, good evening. Should we be taking it in our stride, something that's never happened before? Clearly an indication that someone in the coalition government is happy to take things to the brink.
Good evening. Well, I think we need to view this both as glass half full and glass half empty. I think the glass half full side was that the Treasury released a SENS announcement on the JSE before the speech was meant to happen, saying they would keep issuance unchanged. I think that's a clear indication that Treasury is taking a conservative fiscal line in terms of the overall macro picture, which is positive for the market. I think the problem is, and without going into the detail, which hasn't been made public, of the budget, there's some very clear and worrying, I think, governance, politics and process problems around the budget. I think a number of parties, this isn't just about the DA, have made it very, very clear since June last year that they would not vote in favour of tax hikes. And I don't think you can just randomly then bring something to Cabinet the morning of the budget and expect it to go through. I think this was a deep miscalculation that ultimately the Finance Minister made, and you can see the volatility that's ultimately resulting from that.
Bluntly, a VAT hike of 2 percentage points was never politically realistic.
Exactly, there would never be the votes. But let's think back to when this happened last time in 2018. We saw the ANC caucus back then really will be the ones who pushed for the watering down of it, who drove the process in committee of changing it. So I think this was always not about the DA. This was about other parties, including the ANC itself, and the ability to get this through the ANC.
Obviously, very few people saw this coming. It's worth remembering. It's never happened before. Are you expecting, markets sort of not overreacting, certainly at this point, but are you expecting the rand and other aspects in our markets to be punished over the next few days?
Well, I think it depends how we come out of this. Remember, I think we talked about it on the show before, we don't have a coalition agreement in place. The dispute resolution mechanism and the clearinghouse is not functioning. If we can get out of this with a deal on the budget, with some form of sort of coalition agreement and some form of working through disputes, then the coalition can come out stronger from this, and it can be a positive after the 12th of March. However, it could be rancorous and we could see the opposite happen. I think it's far, far too early to call this a GNU stability risk point, but clearly there are risks around this that we have to watch. If we're not going to do a 2 percentage point VAT hike, a lot of other stuff is going to have to change in the budget. Some pips are going to have to squeak somewhere as a result.
Peter Attard Montalto, thank you, Managing Director at Krutham. Lukhona Mnguni is a governance, politics and development specialist. Lukhona, good evening. Good to talk to you again. The DA puts out a statement essentially claiming victory. On their words, they've sort of protected people from a VAT hike. The ANC and the Finance Minister, I suppose, left in an impossible position. Does the coalition government come back from this?
Good evening, Stephen. Always a pleasure talking to you and 702 listeners. And of course, the coalition does come back from this. You'll understand that politically, the DA had lost out on a number of issues: Bella, NHI Act, Expropriation Act, and I think that, in one instance, this is a good political, move for them, and it's one up on the ANC. But it's also a good test in terms of the statement of intent about, what we were always debating, what this, some broad consensus means in terms of the 60% of the parties that are there. And I think this is, also this was a confluence of an issue where the DA would not support the ANC, but the ANC, unlike in Gauteng when the budgets were passed after the constituting of government last year, they would then get support from MK and EFF. In this instance, it was quite clear to the ANC that MK and EFF would also not support a 2% increase on VAT, and therefore the ANC was actually left on the back foot. We can then debate whether or not it was wise to postpone the budget, because remember, all that the minister does is to table various division of revenue bills to Parliament, and it's still available to Parliament to discuss and develop the necessary viable consensus across the parties. Whether or not today's withdrawal was a bit dramatic is something that we will have to analyze as we go by.
Lukhona, sometimes in politics, one shock leads to other shocks. In other words, in a situation like this, something that's never happened before, everything's shaken a little bit. Could we have some other surprises over the next few days? Maybe divisions in the ANC over the proposed VAT increase, or, I don't know, someone important somewhere resigning or something like that. I mean, are we now in that kind of political environment?
I don't think it will be resignations per se, Stephen. I mean, if you listen to one of the interviews by Fikile Mbalula, I think with the SABC earlier this afternoon, he was quite clear that as the ANC, they are not fully in support of a VAT increase. Because remember that the president is ANC, the minister of finance is ANC, and the pain that then gets visited to society and to the broader public is visited by ANC politicians, and therefore moving towards the next local government elections and national elections, it really puts the ANC on a serious back foot. You'll know the backlash when Malusi Gigaba was Minister of Finance and introduced the 1 percentage point VAT increase in terms of moving from 14% to 15%. It really created a storm for the ANC, and I think, from an electoral point of view, that was a time when the electorate could see that we are actually being harmed here by those who govern us, and those things have multiple effects. Of course, the ANC can come back and say, yeah, but the minister was going to issue directives on a number of expansions if you look at the leaked statement, on a number of expansions on zero-rated stuff and so on. But we can also debate that zero-rated goods do not necessarily become cheaper on the shelves, Stephen. You know that if you do your own groceries, eggs, bread, and so on, these are not cheap items at all. They continue to accumulate because you don't zero-rate them across the value chain of their production and then to the shelf in the supermarket. So I think that the ANC definitely does have a hot potato on their hands, because it's now out in the open that this was their... Effectively, what the DA has done is to say this was not the GNU proposal, this was an ANC proposal, and almost to an extent, some now saying this was an Enoch Godongwana proposal.
Lukhona Mnguni, thank you so much. Governance, politics and development specialist. More in a moment.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Viv Govender's portfolio manager at Rand Swiss. Viv, good evening. Nothing else to talk about apart from what didn't happen today. The budget. How do you sum up the market, the Rand reaction to the postponement?
Look, it's weaker definitely than it was at the start of the day. But, it's not as blown out as you would think. If you look at just where the Rand is right now, just between about, say, 1850, 1860, around about there. 1856 last time I checked. And you compare that to where it was over the last, I would say, a few weeks or so. It's pretty much in that range, over the last couple of days. And I think that, yes, we can from about 1830 where it was at the start of the day, but 1850 is definitely not out of range we had experienced, for the last couple of weeks in February.
One of the problems when something like this happens is that if it is true that business sentiment has been bolstered over the last sort of few months by the National Coalition, every time something happens, it just looks more vulnerable because of the shock of today, because so few people saw this coming.
Yeah, well, certainly. I was preparing for a little presentation on this thing, and, basically almost like, had it all sorted out. And then this surprise, thing happened, and it had to be totally thrown out of the window. It was a shock, and it is also an unprecedented thing, because the one thing about South Africa you must understand is that, yes, we are a developing country, etc., but compared to most of the developing countries out there, even countries that are wealthier than us, like Turkey and so on, we have had remarkable financial stability. The market knows what to expect from South Africa. It knows the kind of announcements that come through. We've been quite reliable, and this kind of news definitely does shake that reputation a bit.
I mean, I suppose the question is, what would it take to restore market faith? And it might take quite a lot to restore market faith. And it would require a real sense that the parties involved are committed to the coalition and won't just fight all the time or use it for grandstanding, which may or may not be happening now.
Yeah, look, I mean, I do think this coalition is not going to last till the next election. I think there's just too many differences as well as much incentives to basically break apart just before, over the sufficient time to the next election, so that you can go out and argue that, we are better and we are the reason that, things went very well and the other guy are the reason that things went very badly, and try and gain share ahead of the next election. So it won't last until, like I said, the next election, but there is hope that it can last a little bit longer. Unfortunately, over the last couple of months, not just with the budget and the VAT dispute, but also with regards to things like, for instance, the Basic Education Act, the health initiative from government, etc., I think we are seeing very clearly that there are fundamental value differences between the ANC and the DA, which are the primary partners in the GNU. And I don't know how exactly you just basically hammer those out to try and provide stability.
Viv Govender, thank you very much indeed, Portfolio Manager at Rand Swiss.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes.
Well, the number, of course, 011 8830702 021 446 0567. Still so many sort of points to make around the cancellation of the budget. And, there's so many different ways of looking at it. I think in the moments of it, people were, oh my word. Then there's a really? Then there's another, oh my word. I think after that, there's a kind of, well, what happens now? There was a presentation later, if we can call it that, by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, and some officials. And then you kind of try and have some kind of sanguinity, if that's a word, to kind of try and understand exactly what's going to happen. So many questions, of course, around what happens now. Now, part of it is around whether the various partners in the coalition get together or not. Part of it is around the political grandstanding. But another big part of it is about what this fight is really about. And the embargo has just been lifted by the National Treasury on all of the Treasury documents, so you'll probably start to see a flood of more reporting on it. But it is about whether or not VAT should be raised by 2 percentage points. The DA says no. I think some other parties in the coalition say no. The ANC says that's what they want to do. And I suspect that we're about to have a big debate around this as a nation. We all know, of course, the shortfall that government has. We start with Lesedi Seforo, the project director for tax advocacy at the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Lesedi, good evening. So we understand, and I think we know the problems that government has. It has real issues in funding the demands on the fiscus. If you look at those problems, PEPFAR, all the rest, is a 2 percentage point hike in VAT the way to resolve those problems?
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I think we should ask ourselves what other options Treasury has. And they have mentioned in their report that increasing the VAT rate is the most effective and least detrimental way of doing it in the economy. They have also given other scenarios, like what would happen if they were to increase the personal income tax rate or the corporate income tax rate. And both of those were found not to be as efficient as an increase in the VAT rate. And also we must remember the fact that they do show in their documents that compared to other countries, our VAT rate is sort of on the lower end. So increasing it by even 2 percentage points, I mean, nobody is going to be happy about that. But compared to other countries, it's not too bad. A lot of the countries in the EU, for instance, their VAT rates are well over 20%.
I mean, there are a few other arguments in favor of a VAT hike. Everyone should feel the pain equally. Other arguments would be that technically it's relatively easy to do. It's hard to avoid. That's a very important argument in this.
Yeah, big one.
There are other arguments against it, and particularly that it affects the poor in a disproportionate way. And that politically is probably what joins the DA and COSATU against the ANC.
Yeah. Unlikely bedfellows over there. And you're right. They do. Treasury have shown again in their report that contrary to popular belief, you do have a lot of the higher income households paying a lot of VAT compared to your more poorer citizens. They have also stated that we must remember that just because VAT is zero rated across they want to increase the basket of goods, for instance, within which VAT will not be payable. But just because that's the case, that does not guarantee that prices will not go up. They were very careful to say that, and that's one of the phenomena and misunderstandings about zero rating VAT on certain goods.
I mean, we know now, and I can say it now because the Treasury documents have just been, the embargo has been lifted. But I mean, I suppose depending on where you sit in our society, there's a much bigger debate on whether increasing the basket of goods that are zero rated really has an impact on people or not.
That's very true. And like you said, politically it affects workers, and that's why when I was reading the documents and looking at all the proposed new goods that will be zero rated, those are, I mean, it's looking okay for those who are more economically disadvantaged. So they were trying to balance the scales. On the one hand, they're increasing the VAT rate by 2%. On the other hand, they're increasing the social grants to above inflation. And then on the other hand, they are extending the basket of goods for zero rating. So it's a good juggling, if I can put it that way. They're doing their best.
Lesedi Seforo, thank you. Project Director for Tax Advocacy at the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Charles de Wet is an executive at ENS and the tax practice. Charles, good evening. Thanks for talking to us again so soon. Would the VAT hike of 2% really made up the shortfall, especially when you take into effect, and I imagine it's hard to sort of game this out, but especially when you take into effect more goods being zero rated for VAT and higher social grants?
I think it would have had quite a big impact, Stephen. You know, I mean, by our calculations, a 1% increase would have been about 30 billion rand. You know, I don't think a 2% makes that 60 billion rand. I mean, what concerns me about it is, you know, if they were looking for 60 billion or even 50 billion, that's a really big number. I think when we started early in the week, we said, you know, maybe 25 to 30 billion in the medium-term budget framework. You know, they said they needed another 22. We thought they could be another 10 down, but it looks at, you know, if it could be 20 billion on top of that. So that is a big number. I think from a, you know, a balancing perspective, I mean, by zero rating some of the products, you know, that would have eaten into that slightly. The grants would have impacted it, and you know, it sounds like the, you know, sort of the public sector wage bill also impacted on it. But it sounds as if we are in a more desperate place than anybody thought we were, and they're going to have to be some tax increases on the 12th of March, or alternatively, we're going to have to increase borrowing that has got its own implications.
I mean, now you have at least one political party in the coalition that has claimed victory. They can't give in easily now, which would suggest to me that a 2 percentage point VAT increase is now off the table. In other words, that's the new reality. Politically, it's impossible.
I would agree with that. You know, whether that takes us back to 1% or zero, I think, you know, so whether we stick to 15 is going to be the big question. You know, I think realistically, if and on the basis that all the other options have been considered, you know, in terms of an increase in personal you know, personal rates, they're going to have to find the funding somewhere, and that is, you know, the best place to do it. So, you know, everything will have to be carved back, and they'll have to, you know, deal with the 28 to 30 billion as opposed to the 45 to 50 billion of additional income, and, you know, cut the slices smaller on the expenditure side.
So, I mean, on expenditure, and plenty of people are going to stand up on any podium and into any microphone they can find over the next few days, and they're going to say government should cut back, and they're going to point to, depending, you know, pick your politician and I'll name you one. But some of them will say it'll be government workers. Some of them will say it'll be government perks. At some point, someone will mention the VIP protection unit. We all know what's going to happen. But isn't it practically actually very difficult to cut back in a big way? Because at some point you are going to cut back the meat of services, the muscle of services, And that is a very difficult thing to do. And we've already seen that in health and education over the last couple of years in some ways.
It comes back to the fundamental problem, and and this is sort of the concerning thing in terms of what they're going to do with the additional 2%. What we need is economic growth, because if we could get economic growth, then we get tax collections up, because the economy generates that in the circumstances, and we create employment. So we're not cutting funding, but we're in fact creating opportunities and generating more revenue, and that's what we should be looking to do. If it went into that, if it went into growing to the economy, that we could get economic growth, far up above 1%, then our problems are solved. But obviously, that's more of a longer term solution and not something that can be done overnight.
And of course, just a reminder that increasing VAT hinders economic growth.
Exactly. So, the impact is there's less money to go around. Households are already under significant pressure, even if they do increase the zero-rated products in the circumstances. So we go through a little bit of a decline before we actually get onto the positive path again. So that's very negative, and it takes longer to get us where we want to go.
Charles de Wet, thank you so much. Executive at ENS in the Tax Practice. You with the Money Show, 10 minutes to 7. Mervyn Abrahams is the Program Coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Project. You'll know, of course, they monitor food prices. They work with people in this space, and they work with people who are often just very much getting by every month. Mervyn, good evening to you. You'll know, of course, now we're going to have a big national debate on the impact of VAT. A 2 percentage point increase in VAT. I presume this would have a huge impact on millions of people who are just finding enough money every month.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to all the listeners. Exactly. I fully agree with you, Stephen. Currently, in terms of the basket of food that we track 44 very basic foods. 22 of those foods are zero-rated. So the 22 foods on which consumers pay VAT, in the month of January, that cost came to 331 Rand. So that's already in the VAT basket, or at least on our basket. 22% would significantly increase that amount, and it would mean in many cases that people will just have to buy less food in order to pay this higher level of VAT.
In the speech that was, I suppose, first leaked, but now all the embargoes have been lifted in the last few moments by the National Treasury, it did look like more items were going to be zero-rated for VAT. Some meat, some milk products, things like that. I mean, does that have a big impact? And I absolutely understand the logic behind it, that there are certain things that should be as cheap as possible and therefore you shouldn't pay any tax on them. But do they actually make much of a difference? And I suppose it would depend how big you make that basket of zero-rated goods.
Exactly, Stephen. So once you start there and you increase, then you have to keep on increasing. And then the question is, well, what's the point of increasing value-added tax? Because then you end up zero-rating so many of the goods that you wish to tax. So I mean, we would have to see exactly what it is that Treasury has in mind in terms of what they would like to zero rate. But Stephen, then there's also the question around administered prices. So, for instance, will there be consideration around zero rating electricity, for instance, charged by municipalities, which includes VAT, on the poorest, various municipal services, etc. And when you start going into that debate, actually the amount of revenue that will be raised by Treasury will actually get less and less. And then the question is really, was this the best instrument in order to raise the extra revenue that is needed?
Obviously, we need extra revenue. I mean, I've asked so many people this over the last few days. What other options are there?
So, yes, and I think that's going to be the million-dollar question. But I think what this will do, now that the budget has been withdrawn, there's this whole debate around value-added tax, now the debate in the country will be around where else do we go. And it might be that for the first time we might be able to have a proper, rational debate around a wealth tax, what that means, who that will target, what percentages are we talking about. We might have a proper debate around who else do we draw in. For instance, the Development Bank of South Africa. How can some of that resources be utilized in terms of our infrastructure build? Where in government do we need to cut back on? And we are not suggesting they cut back on nurses and doctors and teachers. But do we require as many politicians as we have in the country at the moment? So for us, this is actually a good, what has happened in a bad way could very well have a good result, in the sense that it now becomes a public debate before the next budget is presented.
So I appreciate and accept and enjoy your sentiment about the debate that we'll have. My concern is that the people who are going to make the decisions about the budget have not changed. It is the same people. And we may well, and we'll probably end up hosting, and I look forward to it, hosting part of that debate here. You know, this will be something that the Money Show will debate for some time, and so we should. I just think that the same people are going to come to the same conclusions because there's a sort of almost a political lock on things, unfortunately. And in fact, strangely, the only reason that we won't get the 2% hike now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, is that now the DA has sort of said on this is the hill on which we will fight. And so that's the only reason it won't happen. Let me put this another way, Mervyn. I'm not convinced our political order as it currently is, and this is not about one party, it's about all of them. I'm not convinced our current political order is actually able to make changes to the system which got that order there in the first place.
Stephen, I fully understand what you're saying, and I hope, I really do hope that there is now a kind of a rationality that enters into the political space. But I'm just thinking back to 2018 when VAT was increased by 1%. And there was massive debate within the Finance Select Committee of Parliament, and evidence were being presented and alternatives were brought. And in the final analysis, the answer that came back was that the minister had tabled the budget, and because the minister had already tabled the budget, the ANC was in no position to change it because he would have to withdraw the entire budget. In this particular instance, we have a different situation in that the budget has not been tabled, and we now know with the embargoes being lifted, all the good things that this budget was talking about, as well as the VAT increase. So I think that there is the possibility of public debate swaying the political people at the moment. And of course the GNU. I think this was a good expression of the GNU where different political parties can hold each other accountable on some matters.
Mervyn Abrahams, thank you very much indeed. Program Coordinator at the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Project.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
All right, you've heard several voices now, the views of several people about all of this and about what's happened today. I'd really like to hear your view on what you think is the way forward from here, what you think is going to happen to the coalition, but also whether this was the right move by the Democratic Alliance and other partners to actually say, we're not going to allow the budget to go ahead. Essentially, that's pretty much what they've done. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Your voice notes welcome as well tonight on The Money Show on 072 702 1702.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
6 minutes after 7, good evening. Welcome to the second hour of The Money Show. The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Well, lots to come in the second hour, moving away from the fact that the budget has now been postponed. We'll talk a little bit about something that happened in Europe over the weekend. And it's really an example, I suppose, about communication. There might be some lessons for you in the business field about communication and how effective it can be. You or someone in your family, do you have a store card? Do you actually have a card that, you know, when you go and buy clothes, you get all sorts of things on the store card? And Wendy Nola has a horror story about one. It is a big name brand. You'll want to stick around. And then I was lucky enough just a few moments ago to go and shake his hand. Billy Tom is the CEO of ISUZU, the current president of the National Association of Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa. Fascinating story, interesting story. Questions to ask also about, I think, the future of the automotive industry. One of those people who I suspect maybe quite likes the smell of diesel. You know, there's some people who quite like a car, motor in the morning. I can be one of them. I never thought I would be, but I'm sort of heading that way, I must just tell you. So we'll talk to him about that, talk about his career and his view on the outlook for the motor industry as well. As always, really good to hear from you. You might well have some views on what is going to happen now around the argument around the budget, around the VAT increase, around the proposed VAT increase, and all of that. 011 8830 702 021 446 0567, and of course voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show.
Business Unusual.
Well, over the weekend, there was a big speech by the US Vice President J.D. Vance, and someone who, unless you've been following American politics very closely, you may not have paid a huge amount of attention to, kind of overshadowed by his President Donald Trump. And it was essentially at the Munich Security Conference, and it was talking about Europe's security in the future. Richard Mulholland is the founder of Missing Link and Too Many Robots. Richard, good evening. I must just say before we start, J.D. Vance's speech didn't get a lot of coverage here. I think the 2 points that maybe came through were that the US will not really defend Europe from Russia. And the second was that he was supporting a party many people accuse of being fascist in Germany. And I think that was kind of the message we received in South Africa. You're watching it from the UK, and you've been studying it from a point of view of communication. You seem to have a sort of different take on what was going on here.
Yeah, Stephen, I think, I don't know if you remember way back when, 2004 in July, Barack Obama, he showed up as a kind of outsider that nobody really paid much attention to. And he delivered an address at the Democratic Convention. And many people think that he won, you know, his election that happened years later at that event that he wasn't even running for. And I think that this speech delivered by J.D. Vance at a security conference in Munich is probably where J.D. Vance officially entered the arena. And I think people will study this speech. There's so much from, you know, as a speechwriter and speaker coach myself, there's so much from it that's absolutely brilliant, even if you disagree with the speech. I'm not getting political here. It's almost irrelevant to what I wanted to chat to you about. But it's a very, very interesting case study and play that I believe that we will be studying this speech in the future and looking at it. And I've been speaking to a lot of business friends and leaders about it. And what struck me is how we ignore these incredible speeches. And in business, we don't take seriously enough this art of rhetoric and communication that politicians are so good at.
I mean, what was the thing that made the difference? I mean, what made it so different?
Okay, so there's a number of things, right? So it's a very, very tricky thing. First of all, just from a pure classical rhetoric point of view, it's a masterclass. He entered, he created commonplace with the group. He did a very, very good job of humanizing himself and his wife. And, you know, there was a terrorist attack in Munich the day before, which actually worked really well for him to a degree. He was able to create massive amounts of ethos. And then once he was very deeply inside the audience, he cast a very good warning shot at them, but then he attacked them from the inside. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant the way he did it. But what's significant, what I find very, very significant about this was he took a very, very different approach to Trump. And Trump generally doesn't enjoy that kind of thing. You know, Pence was a yes man. He played the game. Trump is a firebrand leader. He uses firebrand rhetoric when he speaks. Whereas J.D. Vance came across as almost populist. He separated the people from governments, and the way he challenged them was brilliant. I also thought the way that he paid lip service, he knew what he was doing, so he would throw in, the Trump administration and talk about Trump and said all the right things. But it was a very, very strategic move on his part, I believe, to put himself forward. And I also thought the message was great. Like, he had certain lines in it that were just wonderful and very evocative. Like, my favorite was he said that, the retreat of Europe from its fundamental values. It's such an evocative line, and the speech was full of little lines like that. I just thought it was an absolute masterclass, and I'm just wondering why people aren't more obsessed with it.
Okay. I suppose one of the questions would be whether or not the truth matters. He also used the speech, as I understand it, to basically claim Europe was moving away from its core values by saying that you're not allowed to harass people coming out of an abortion clinic by standing closer than 100 meters and holding a protest there. I don't think most Europeans believe that, and I don't think they'll have changed their view because of what he said.
Well, he quoted a letter that was sent to people in Scotland in houses within that 350-meter line from abortion clinics that were told that prayer inside their own homes could be considered an act of aggression to people wanting to go and have abortions. And this is a very Orwellian, and they also encourage people to report on people that they've caught praying near abortion clinics. This really is an Orwellian approach to Big Brother that is quite scary to see, and it certainly does, challenge some of the values that I think we should be holding close to ourselves. But again, I think that even if I didn't like what he said, I've read his book as well. I think he's a very interesting character. He wrote that book, The Hillbilly Elegy, because he's he's essentially a hillbilly. That's what he is. He came from Kentucky, and he's a very, very interesting player. But I believe that you could challenge the truth of some of his statements. So certainly, I think he made missteps, and there were certainly some cards that he played in the speech that I don't think were great. But from a sheer point of view of being able to go into the heart of Europe's security leaders and challenge them that way, I think that his approach was the only way it was possible to do it. Because, as I said, he climbed inside the audience and then attacked them from within, which was very, very smart.
Okay, so there are various things here. Part of it is about communication. Part of it is about how you change people's minds. So, I hear what you say about, a speech that kind of happened some time ago does set someone on a path, and that's certainly true of Obama, and might well turn out to be true here. There are a couple of things that you need to come out of a speech like that. And if you're in business, there are a few things. You make a speech for a reason. You want to see something change. And I suppose you want to see, and this is the whole point of communication in politics, is to change the minds of people. Do you think it succeeded in that?
I think it's certainly, we have to consider what the victory condition, what I believe, and obviously I'm not spoken to the Vice President of the United States. I think the victory condition of this speech was a lot bigger than the results of the speech itself. I think Vance wanted to set himself up as a different kind of leader. So while he was very much towing the American Republican line, he showed himself to be extremely, extremely different and more personable than Donald Trump. So he's kind of like, if I am going to have an enemy, at least if I have somebody like this, or somebody who's more like me. And I think that was the real play. This is why I think it was so interesting, because even people who disagreed with the speech would have found themselves nodding along to certain parts of it. And he's a much harder guy to dislike than Trump. And so I believe that the victory condition of this was to set himself up as a different voice. I believe that the difference between a leader and a manager is the ability to communicate. I really do believe this. And past vice presidents have been managers. He has shown himself to be a leader here. And I guess why I was so determined to chat to you about this tonight, because I know this isn't the normal topics we discuss, is that I've had so many conversations about this in the last few days, and I'll be chatting about his use of anaphora and epistrophe and things. And most of my circle of friends are business leaders and things. And I was struck by how little people have an understanding of the mechanisms of persuasive communication, something that I almost take for granted and I just assume that everybody thinks about. This feels like a very, very lost art. And the only people that are finding it, again, are the, your Douglas Murrays and your Jordan Petersons, big politicians. And I think business people are ignoring it. And I believe that they're doing it at their peril. And I think that the business people need to start, business leaders need to start looking at speeches like this and seeing what they can learn from it. Because there's certainly good ways of building, both pushing an agenda politically or I guess economically from a business point of view, but also building the profile of the leader itself.
Thank you very much. Richard Mulholland is the founder of Missing Link and Too Many Robots.
The Money Show.
Consumer Ninja.
Wendy Nola, of course, is your consumer ninja, and she's been looking at the issue of store cards. You may have one. There may be someone in your family who has one. And often they can be amazing value for money. But there's also a lot of fine print that you really do need to read and keep a very close eye on. Wendy, good evening. This is particularly around the kind of upselling of services. And it's a strange story about what happened when someone decided to cancel one and what happened after that.
Hi, Stephen. Yes, indeed. Millions of South Africans have these store cards. It's normally the first form of credit. Interest rates are high, but it does work for a lot of people. But they inevitably get hit with upsells. So a bit like in a restaurant when you order a salad and they say, "Oh, would you like Avo with that?" In the financial services industry, they upsell products they call value-added services, VAS, for extra revenue. I don't know how much value the consumer gets, but so monthly club memberships, not so sure about those. And then, of course, it's very popular for them to team up with other financial service providers and offer life policies, funeral policies, account protection. So if you become disabled or you get retrenched, your balance is written off. But get this, in the case of RCS, which manages the Edgar's account book, if you close your account, unless you specifically ask for all those extras to be terminated as well, they just continue, including the premium of the account protection policy on the account that's no longer no longer there.
So you close your account and the insurance premium on something that is no longer usable is still being charged to you. I mean, that's just bad practice. That's just immoral, surely. Someone's making money off it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I said. I think it's unconscionable. There should be a mechanism, because they say, well, these are third-party providers that provide these policies, not us. I'm like, well, you're the platform, you're the conduit. Your customers deal with you. There should be some automatic thing that, and certainly in the case of account protection, that there's an instruction goes and it ends. But apparently, obviously, it won't go too far, because once the premium isn't being, if you don't pay your premium, then the policy will lapse. But anyway, how this all came about, Stephen, was that George and Corsi asked for my help last week with regard to an Edgar's debt, which he'd been handed over for. He said he was being bullied and harassed, but he says, they claim I owe something like 1,200 Rand. They call me several times a day. They send me text messages. George is in his late 60s. He'd had his Edgar's account for more than 20 years when, in early November last year, he decided that he wanted to pay it off and settle the balance and close the account. So he went into a store at the Glen. He says, I paid the amount owing, whatever they asked me to pay, and I said they should close the account because I didn't have any intention of using it again. He said the assistant helping him said she would make a call to the accounts department so that he could talk to them himself, but the line was continuously engaged. So he said, in the end, I left and I requested that she make a note to that effect. So this is definitely a no-no. You must be in control of that process. I get this a lot. You must send an email to the company yourself so you know it's closed. And also, Stephen, it's very common for people to think when they settle an account that automatically closes it, but it doesn't. So all these extras then you carry on being liable for them, right? So he says, George never heard from them for a couple of months, and then all of a sudden he got a text message saying that he had this outstanding amount, and the messages keep coming, he says. He went to the Edgar's branch and Mall of the South to sort things out. And he was then told for the first time, you owe Edgar's store for club fees. And he says, but why? I closed my account. He said, please write everything off, close my account. and he thought that was the end of it. But last week, which is when he contacted me, he got a text from RCS telling him that his debt had now been handed over to Debt Collectors MBD.
Okay, so basically, he had done everything as far as he knew correctly. He had closed the account. They were still charging. And I mean, I can't get away from this. They must have a system that knows they're charging closed accounts, and Edgar's must know that they are wrong to do that.
I couldn't really get an answer on that. Other than, as I said earlier, they say that certainly in the case, some people have funeral policies. George didn't have a funeral policy. He just had his club membership fee, which was in the amount of some 47 Rand, and then this account protection policy. But many people do have funeral policies and life policies, and RCS says that it wouldn't be in the consumer's interest if these automatically ended because, what if they needed to make a claim? What people needed to do was set up another way of paying for them directly to the pollard or whatever that case may be by debit order. So anyway, I took up this case with the RCS Group's CEO, Reagan Adams. He says George never instructed the store to close the account. Of course, George denies this and said, of course he did. He just couldn't get through to the accounts department, But he has no proof of that, as is the problem when you do things verbally. And he said, but as you say, my big sort of takeout from this story was that even if George's verbal instruction had been actioned to close the account, he would, unless he specifically said, also please end my club membership and end my account protection fee, because that didn't happen. Even if he said close the account, that would have gone on unless he specifically made that instruction. So he was charged, 78 Rand, not 40-something, 78 Rand for his Edgar's Club and 5 Rand 72 for the account protection plan. But you can imagine the scale of this thing. That's a lot of money. And I said, as you said, I said to Adam, surely account holders should be informed of this, interest of full disclosure, that they need to specifically end these extras, these so-called value added. And he said, yes, it's clear in all our T's and C's on our website and in our FAQs. So I went back and said, no, surely that's not enough. And he said, okay, sorry, let me clarify. It's definitely a practice in store and through the call center that we advise customers to cancel their VAS products, blah, blah, blah. Didn't happen in George's case. Even when he phoned in to query this, he wasn't told that he had specifically cancelled. Anyway, the good news is George's 1,423 Rand debt has now been written off. His account is closed. They've sent him a letter confirming this. And the reason it was written off, according to Adams, was because when George questioned why he was still being billed on his Edgar's account, the agent he spoke to should have handed it to a senior person to, quote, take discretion on the scenario, but that didn't happen. And also he was charged 24 Rand 15 for a call made to him last month demanding payment. That's what in the collections world they're allowed to charge. It's quite a lot added to a bill if you think about it. So the takeout from this for me is that settling your balance doesn't close your account. As I said earlier, it's very important to have a specific instruction around that and to do that via email so that you have a record of it. And then again, you can't assume that everything is going to come to an end. You have to specifically say, I also want you to cancel my club membership fee, and I also want you to cancel whatever these insurances are, because otherwise they just continue. So I think a lot of people could potentially be caught by this. And if they're doing it in store, which many people do, they feel more comfortable doing things face to face. You then have no proof of what you requested, what they said in response. So it's very important to create a paper trail for yourself and to be very specific about the closure of an account. And just one last thing, if you settle your account and you don't actually close it, you are leaving the door open for fraudsters to spend on your account as well. I've had many cases like that as well. So just to be very explicit around the closing of your accounts, I want it closed, and close all the rest of them too, please. Otherwise, you carry on being liable, as in George's case.
Sure. Wendy Nola, thank you very much indeed. Your consumer ninja on The Money Show.
The Money Show.
Shapeshifters.
Well, we've got some time now to take a break from the fact that we don't have a budget or anything like that and speak to someone who's played a really long, important role in our economy, done different things, been in different places, but now finds himself the CEO of a really important company in South Africa. The company is ISUZU, and I'm talking, of course, about their CEO, Billy Tom. He's also I say moonlights as president of the National Association of Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa. And that, I think, shows you the esteem in which he's held in our car industry. Billy, thanks so much for coming in. I know you've had a long day. You've been at the head office in Thailand and all the rest. So thank you for taking the time and coming to speak to us this evening on The Money Show.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to the listeners. I'm really excited to be here. The last time I was here was almost 18 years ago.
Wow. Okay. You would have found me here then.
Definitely.
So, I mean, when I think of ISUZU, I immediately think of the smell of diesel. I mean, I don't know why. Does the smell of diesel mean something to you as the CEO of a company that makes products that use it?
It means a lot, Stephen. I'm a plus yappy from the Eastern Cape, small town called Alexandria.
Oh, yes.
So I drove a tractor at the age of 6.
6?
And I got my truck license a lot earlier. That's a discussion for another day. So I've been a truck driver for 38 years. So diesel has been running in my veins. My first 3 cars were diesel cars, and they were ISUZU bakkies. So I've always enjoyed diesel. I've always enjoyed the automotive space. I mean, grew up liking cars.
I have this image of you maybe with blocks or something on your feet to try and reach the pedals of this tractor.
No, definitely. It used to be in one gear, and then that was the second gear, and I couldn't change it. And I wasn't allowed. And when I had to press the clutch, I had to stand up to press the clutch.
If only there were video of that.
No, definitely.
Okay, so I mean, you were growing up in the Eastern Cape. You were growing up on a farm. Lots of people have very different experiences of growing up on a farm. What was it like for you?
It was with mixed feelings because the farmer we grew up in those days was well ahead of his time. I mean, my father, for a black man to be a foreman in a farm was unheard of. So that's where I had the opportunity of driving the tractors and being able to drive the truck. But also the 80s was a very turbulent period in the Eastern Cape. I mean, I tell people I've got a degree in Standard 7 because I had to redo Standard 7 3 times because of the uprisings. As a result of that, I did my matric at the age of 21 and then went to university. I went to Rhodes University, which was the nearest university, where I studied business management and information systems. And for some reason, coming out of Rhodes, I worked in the liquor industry. I don't know whether there's any correlation there. I worked at a company called Stellenbosch Farmers Winery, was based in Mthatha. After that, I joined SA Breweries. From SA Breweries, I worked for a short while at the bank, at Standard Bank. Then I joined the auto industry. If you recall, there was a stage where South Africa had a craze when we were launching the Hummer. I was part of that team that launched the Hummer in 2007. Then I spent some time at Coca-Cola, spent 12 years at Coca-Cola, then took a short break, and then here am I, almost 5 years later, heading ISUZU Motors South Africa.
The fact that you had to repeat a standard through no fault of your own, I mean, so much was happening then. And then you obviously went to university at a more mature age than many other people did. Did that maybe change your approach in some way, do you think? I mean, do you think that maybe that had an impact on how well you did and just the way you considered things? There are plenty of people who flame out in first year.
I must say it was very humbling because some of the people that were in my class were much younger than me. So I had to learn to work with people a lot younger than me. But I think I was also a lot more matured when I was at university. But I also made friends with my reality because I came from a family. I mean, my dad was a farm truck driver. My mom was a domestic worker. So when I went to university, I had to pick things that I needed and had to do because I had a very limited budget. But I managed to go through it. But also because I was a lot older, I mean, I used to work. I used to drive trucks during my holidays. So it kept me away from mischief, but also taught me a lot about logistics. As a result, when I started working, I made up for all those years because I was only a trainee for 6 months. Then I got a managerial role, which speeded up the process, and I managed to catch up.
It's interesting. So when you were studying university, did you know what you wanted to do? I mean, maybe, but did you know did you have an idea at that point?
Stephen, I started off, my dream was being a long-distance truck driver.
Yeah.
And then my mom wouldn't hear anything. I mean, she insisted that I go to school whether I had a license or not. When I went to university, initially I wanted to do computer studies, but I realized me and sitting behind a computer desk is not for me. Then I enjoyed management. By the time I was on my second year, I knew that I would be in a leadership role. But I think sometimes society plays a role in who you are, because people kept on voting for me, whether it was a house committee or a senior student, and that puts a lot of responsibility in you. And I was also a house warden at some stage. And then I realized I think I'm needed in a leadership role. And that's where I ended up as a management trainee in my first role. And then I started seeing myself growing from one role to the other role.
There would have been, at that time, very few people like you, like your father, in a leadership role in a society that was beginning to change. That must have been quite interesting.
Yeah, it was very interesting. But to me, Stephen, I mean, we make jokes about farmers.
Yeah.
But I can say you will find farmers that are visionaries. I mean, for instance, if you look at my case, my education was paid for by the farmers, and they could see the country changing. But also, I mean, in those days, we used to say boss and missus. But then they were able to transition where they said, listen, the country has changed. We are now friends. Some of them, 35, 40 years later, we're still friends. I mean, the Eastern Cape farmers, a lot of them, I still visit them. And but once again, it's a collective effort by society to get someone to be where I am today.
They must be immensely proud. I mean, when you go and visit, they must be so happy to see you.
Very, very proud, Stephen. I mean, I've done a lot of talks to people, talking about where I come from and where I am today. But that environment has also helped me understand the people I work with today. I understand the various cultures I work with, understand the backgrounds of people, and it helps me know which touch points to touch when you interact with people.
Were there any experiences earlier on in your career, working in your first job, and alcohol, you sort of did time at Coca-Cola as well, but you were also at Distel. Were there sort of experiences that really, you come into these positions already having some experience of leadership and people having looked to you for leadership? Were there experiences that really you learned from, or experiences that kind of set you on a path? You thought, if I can see this is the thing. If I get this right, then this is going to happen. Or if, this is a sort of lesson that I need to remember for the rest of my career and the rest of my life. There are sometimes moments early on in someone's career that make you go, now I know kind of what I need to do.
I think to me, one of the first experiences, and I stayed with my manager in those days, David Joseph. And one of the things he impressed on me was the importance of family. The role the family plays. And as a result, I'm with my daughter here. They've watched me journey. And that plays a very key role, because sometimes in life you go through certain things. Like 12 years ago, I ended up in a hospital, and the people that will go in and visit you there are your family.
Yeah.
And they play a very key role. When you go back home after hours, the family is the one that will spend time with you. When you retire, the family is the one. The second part is it's also about being disciplined and not having your soul up for sale. Corporates, it's not an easy environment. There are people there that will buy your soul, and if you want to sell it, you might not get it back in the same format it is. And but when you are principled, you stand your ground, it also comes at a price. To be where I am today, I had to take some detours. I remember in one instance, I had to leave a role I was fairly senior at because the environment was toxic and my soul was not available. I took a principled decision. But one thing you must also remember, truth doesn't have many friends. When I went and I sat at home, people went and kept quiet because nobody wanted to talk to you because you didn't want to play part in that. But sometimes certain things you can't undo. Because I never played part in what I didn't believe in, there was nothing to justify. And today when I stand up and I talk, someone doesn't point back and say, you played in an unsavory activity in an organization. So those are the learnings for me, because these things follow you years later. And you always have to be very careful about the decision you take.
And you can only sell it once, and if you refuse the first time, it's easier to refuse the second time.
And if you say yes the first time, someone will ask you, but you did participate.
So I mean, I found it interesting. Do you find that there's a big difference between the sort of fast-moving consumer goods industry, between the liquor industry and the car industry? I mean, obviously you mustn't mix them, but I mean, apart from that, do you find big differences? I mean, are the nuts and bolts of the actual business quite similar?
Look, the FMCG, Stephen, it's like playing action cricket or 2020. It's very fast-paced. You've got to make decisions on the fly, and there is constant pressure. The automotive industry is very well planned and fairly slower than it is. But to me, the core thing are the leadership principles. They fairly the same. And but also, I mean, like now I've learned to relate with people. I've learned there is only one language, and it's Ubuntu. Like I work with Japanese colleagues who don't speak English. And how do you build a connection with someone who doesn't understand your language? I mean, like now I was in Thailand on Monday. We're speaking through an interpreter. So someone is interpreting, and how do you make your point? How do you ensure that that person, despite them not talking your language, there is trust? But when someone sees Ubuntu in you, it talks a lot, and you are able to break a lot of barriers. And to me, that's been the learning. The other one is, I think as you grow in organizations, you've got to be trusting. I mean, we've now forgotten about COVID, but COVID to me was a big lesson on trust. Because during COVID, your staff couldn't come to work. You had to trust that they are doing what they're supposed to do. And I mean, I'll talk for ISUZU because I was at ISUZU. Our employees proved us well that they can be trusted. As a result, I mean, I had to change my leadership style. In the past, I was disciplined. I mean, those that know me, I used to have things like the 5-minute rule. When you had a meeting with me, you had to be 5 minutes early. These days, COVID proved me that, listen, forget about the 5-minute rule. When you trust people, they will come to party. And that's been one of the bigger learnings. And that's why, as a CEO, I had to change my style from when I was a general manager.
It must have been a moment during that time when you were really concerned about your workers, about your family, about what was going to happen to the car industry. Some of us in the media were allowed to keep going. Car factories, not so much. You also wouldn't know what was going to happen with demand. It must have been quite scary. It must have demanded a lot of you to lead during that time.
Stephen, I signed my contract 2 days before lockdown. Yeah. So I've never signed a contract that quickly. I didn't look at the details of my contract. And then I had to start working during COVID. So I had to meet people online. I had to meet my principals 10,000 kilometers online. And we had to save an industry. I mean, I remember starting a job and getting a 20% reduction because we were only working 4 days. We're not working 5 days. But I think we did a lot of things that ensured that people don't lose jobs. I mean, at ISUZU, we didn't lose a single job. In fact, when I started, I think we had 900 odd people. Today, we're sitting with 1,200 people. We managed to add more. But again, it was through the efforts of the employees. I mean, nothing was dropped. It was tough. But I think as South Africa, I think initially the way we handled COVID, I mean, we handled it very well. Years later on, we did become a little bit clumsy as a country. But I think when we started off very well.
Sometimes I've met people in a crisis, whatever it can be, at a press conference or something. And because I met them during a crisis, I got to know them very quickly. You got to know where their limits were, what they would do, what they wouldn't do, whether you can trust them or not. And I found actually sometimes there was no better way to get to know someone quickly. Was there a bit of that?
Yeah, no. I mean, COVID helped us understand our people very well. But the other learnings as well was, some people were not proud of their environments. They wanted to come back to their office space. I mean, there were domestic issues some people experienced during the pandemic, and we had to bring people back despite the challenges we had. But again, I mean, that crisis really, I think, it pulled leadership out of many of us, to stand up and be counted.
We're speaking to Billy Tom, the CEO of ISUZU, current president of NAAMSA. He's your shapeshifter tonight on The Money Show.
The Money Show.
Shapeshifters.
Speaking to Billy Tom this evening, the CEO of ISUZU, president of the National Association of Automobile Manufacturers of South Africa. Billy, so you're sort of leading the car industry, and there's certain transitions, big transitions that are underway. And these transitions sort of speed up and slow down, and that creates all sorts of problems for the platinum price, for example. But I'm talking specifically about moving away from petrol and diesel cars to hybrid and electric cars. To me, as a journalist who's sitting a long way from Gqeberha and Roslyn, I worry deeply that we're falling quite far behind and that the rest of the world is moving very quickly here, despite all of the problems they're having.
Yeah, Stephen, I mean, we really in the transition. Maybe to give context, if you look at South Africa's auto industry, the new energy vehicles are contributing about 2.5% of the total industry, but growing very fast. But of that 2.5%, about 85% are the hybrids. And I think for quite some time as an industry, we were very concerned because for you to invest, there needs to be a policy certainty. And for quite some time, that policy certainty was lacking in South Africa. Because remember, the investment decisions are not made in South Africa. Like, for instance, in my case as ISUZU, that decision is made in Yokohama in Japan. And there is a certain time window. And I think in many instances, because of uncertainty, we might have missed some important dates. But I must say, I think since we've had the new government, in October, we met the president and we had a good discussion. He made some announcements. And those announcements are bringing a lot of certainty to the industry. We're confident that with Minister Tau on board, in fact, we call him, he's a striker for NAAMSA. So we are the backline. He needs to score goals for us as a minister. We are confident that we've now started making inroads. I mean, next week we are meeting with him. We've set up a meeting with him where we will, close off some of the issues that we've been having. And we're confident that I think we will be able to rescue what was concerning us.
I mean, it needs to move fast. This whole thing needs to move quite quickly.
No, definitely it needs to. I mean, we were very slow for quite some time, but I'm confident that, we are talking enough, and I think there is movement. I think the president committed. I mean, he surprised everybody, walked in at the SA Auto Week and made announcements which I think took some of the government people by surprise because he moved faster than them. Now it's put pressure back on government.
I wonder about the longer-term future of a car industry. So in many cities in the global north, public transport works, is very popular, etc. In many places, individuals will use an e-bike that costs almost nothing in places like London to get around, and many people can use them. Obviously, there will always be some kind of trucking industry because you need to move goods and you need to move them point to point. And individuals still will need to move point to point. Do you think over time we're just going to see a lot less demand for a kind of personal transport vehicle, which we currently call a car?
Stephen, the auto industry, I mean, last year we celebrated 100 years in the country, in South Africa. NAAMSA this year is celebrating 90 years, so we've been around for quite a while. But some of the talk we use is the change we expect in the next 10 years will be more than the change we've seen in the last 100 years. I think consumer behavior is definitely driving some of the things. Some of the people, I mean, want to do e-hailing. I think there's a lot of developments. But being in the African continent, I think one needs to look and say, will we move as fast as Europe? Probably not as fast as Europe. When you move outside South Africa, because I think we need to be closely linked to the continent, I think there's still an opportunity for people to buy cars. I think the number of vehicles being sold in the continent is still very low. And my view is, as South Africa, I mean, if you think of it, we produce for every 100 cars that are built in the continent, 53 are made in South Africa. And to me, where the big opportunity lies for South Africa is the African continent. And what are the things that we think we need to do? I think South Africa needs to sign more bilaterals with some of the manufacturing clusters. For instance, Algeria. In 2011 to 2013, I think we exported about 24,000 LCVs. Today, we export nothing. Why do we not sign a bilateral?
Yeah.
And to me, we can export cars to Algeria, we can import cars to South Africa. Sign a bilateral with Egypt, and then we trade with them. To me, that is what can grow the South African industry, but also Africa. Because I think the number I heard the other day is that intra-trade in Africa is sitting at 18%. In the European Union, it's at 80%.
Yeah.
To me, that's one big opportunity to grow the industry. It's also trading within Africa, and that's how we can sell more vehicles. But I agree with you. There is going to be a lot of consumer behavior where people are using e-hailing and other forms of transport.
Billy Tom, thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. It's fascinating to hear your story.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Billy Tom.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by AMSA Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
Billy Tom is the CEO of ISUZU and the current president of NAAMSA. That conversation for you available as a podcast in just a couple of moments. Will there be a budget tomorrow? No. But we will bring you another budget edition on the 12th of March. We'll be back tomorrow. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock.